If you notice that I have titled this particular lecture as Ethics as First Philosophy. This is the claim by Emmanuel Levinas. Emmanuel Levinas somehow has some of the most inspiring thought about ethics, very fascinating, very powerfully inspiring. We may not be able to exhaust all his ideas. What I intend to do today is to somehow vibrate with him, resonate with this thinking. As a brief background, Emmanuel Levinas was born Jew in the Eastern Europe of Lithuania, moved to France, in Paris. And of course, he was a student of Edmund Husserl in Strasbourg, in Germany. Then, of course, he was also a student of Heidegger himself. He was very fascinated by Heidegger's teaching until the whole Nazi episode began to unfold. He somehow thought Heidegger was complying with the Nazi rule, so much so Heidegger took the chair of philosophy soon after Husserl was thrown away from the chair by the Nazi government. Husserl being a Jew, he was removed from the chair and Heidegger was reinstated there. And it was all done in a hurry. Heidegger has not even published his book. He had to publish it in a hurry. His book being on time, that is why it was an unfinished work. That work is not a complete work. So Levinas could never forgive Heidegger for what he thought his accomplice with the Nazi government. Now, there are a lot of debates whether Heidegger was really an accomplice or not. In any case, one thing we know for sure, Heidegger was silent at least about the Nazi persecution of the Jews. To that extent, at least, Levinas' anger towards Heidegger was justified. So this has triggered Levinas' thinking, particularly by using Husserl's phenomenology. He exactly wanted to overturn Heidegger's ontology as first philosophy. Levinas believed it is Heidegger's ontology as first philosophy has led to many different forms of violence. And hence he wants to reinstate ethics as first philosophy in order to challenge Heidegger's fundamental ontology. Levinas thought ontology always begins with the self. The question of being always begins with one's own being. That has a narcissistic tendency, the love for the self, to the detriment of the negation of the other, to the extent of doing violence to the other. Ethics, on the contrary, Levinas thinks, begins with the other, not with one's own self. And that is what we need to privilege, that is what we want to make as first philosophy. This is only an introductory note about his thinking. Nevertheless, Levinas also had a secret admiration for Heidegger. In fact, when he was asked in one of the interviews, who according to you is the best 20th century philosopher, his reply was, I must admit with pain that it is Heidegger. Well, he accepts it as Heidegger, but there is a pain in admitting it. So he very nicely puts it, I must admit it with pain, it is Heidegger. Now, to begin this particular lecture, let us try and see if you can pay attention to this particular image for a while. Look closely at this image. This image is representative of many people of this kind that we may come across in everyday life. Look at the person's, the child's face. What does it tell you? Does it tell you anything at all? Does the face reveal something to you? Does it challenge you some way, somehow? What is the challenge that the face offers to you? Just stay with that image for a moment. Allow your consciousness and your conscience to be shaken. Levinas thinks the face of the other speaks to us. We tend to ignore the other because we try to make philosophy of totality. We have a nostalgia for totalizing everything. What is the meaning of totalizing? Totalizing would mean you try to do philosophy by reducing the otherness in the other to the sameness of the self. Philosophy always focuses on understanding others. And how do you understand others? By always reducing them to the category of your mind. This process is called the totalization, and that is the philosophy of totality. When you look at a person, you always try to categorize the person into some categories which are in your mind already. You don't look at the person as an individual right in front of you, but you see him or her with all the prejudices, preconceived ideas that you have about the person of that type. When you see a poor man on the street, immediately you try to reduce him to the category of either representation of poverty or representation of social regress, someone whose existence is not contributing to the society, whatever that you have in your mind. This is how you reduce the otherness to the sameness of the self. That is our nostalgia for totality. And philosophy always has been doing this. This is because philosophy oftentimes begins with the self. This is true of philosophy in antiquity and true of modernity and even in contemporary times. Take, for example, Descartes' philosophy. It always begins with I think. And therefore, you try to reduce everything else to your thinking. But the other always resists categorization. The other eludes your understanding. The other is so infinite, you cannot really fully comprehend the other. The other escapes every attempt that you make to categorize the other. That is because the other has a surplus of meaning. You cannot really exhaust that meaning, especially by your categories of mind. The other will never fit the categories of your mind, however hard you try. Therefore, for Levinas, the absolute other, when he speaks about the absolute other, the otherness of the other, not something that is akin to me, not something that is similar to me, there is a total strangeness, the otherness in the other. He uses a typical specific French word, autre, in contrast to autrui, which means the other who is like me. Now here it is an absolute other. The other is absolutely different from me. There is a strangeness, there is a foreignness in the other, the otherness or the alterity. That is not fully given to my consciousness. The absolute other is never fully given to in my consciousness. But this other constantly makes an appeal to me. Let us go back to the image of the child who is carrying a heavy basket on her head. Whichever way you try to reduce that, you will never exhaust the meaning of the other. You will never be able to comprehend that child's agony or the child's misery or whatever it is. But what you do notice is the appeal, the demand the child makes on you. The other is always absolute. It can only make a demand on you. It can challenge you. This is because the other is infinite. Now, what is infinity for Levinas? Infinity belongs to the idea of existence without me existing. So it is a simple ilia, there is. Now there is no qualification of what there is. There is something, there is this, there's no. There is. There is a plenitude of the existence, the very idea of existence. You can never reduce to this or that. And it is to this order the other belongs. And the face of the other speaks to me. Now, when we speak about the face of the other, you should understand two important things. The face is not the physical face. Normally, when we speak about the face with two eyes, two ears, a mouth, and so on, it is not a physical description of the face, but it is a phenomenological understanding of the face. The face which, in a certain way, is given to my consciousness, but at the same time, the face is never ever fully comprehended by my consciousness. The face is only the trace of the infinity. You never get the whole view of the infinity. You never ever fully understand, comprehend the other. You get a glimpse of it. The face is only the trace of that infinity. Now, Levinas has taken this idea of the trace of the infinity from Descartes himself. For Descartes, we are the traces of the infinite God. We don't exhaust God within ourselves, but we carry within us the trace. So also the face of the other is only the trace of the infinity. It is not the everything of the other is never ever exhausted in that face. But nevertheless, this face is given to my consciousness. And the fact it is given to my consciousness in a particular way, it speaks to me. Again, not in terms of articulated language, but in unspoken words. And what it speaks to me is always, it comes to me as a command, a demand. Do not kill me. Do not oppress me. Do not subjugate me. And that is a command it makes. When you look at the face of the innocent child forced to do labor, there is a command on you. Don't let me suffer this way. And that is how the face speaks to you. And all that you need to do is to respond to the demand of the face of the other. So therefore, the relationship between me and the other for Levinas is an asymmetrical relationship. Asymmetry means equal. You both are on equal ground. That is asymmetrical. Now, the other is on moral high ground. I am here merely responding. We are not on equal footing. I am only giving a response to the demand, moral demand made by the other. So this asymmetry between the other and me is what constitutes my moral consciousness. If this is not there, my consciousness is dead. We should let the other have the high moral ground to make the demand on me. And that is why he calls this an asymmetrical relationship. This is very different from what Gabriel Marcel or Martin Buber would call the I-thou relationship. The I-thou relationship is always reciprocal. Here there is no reciprocity. The other is the one who commands, and then I respond to the command. That is because the other has the high moral ground. This ability to respond to the demands of the other or the command of the other is what Levinas calls responsibility for the other. I am responsible for the other. So the command is given to me. All that I have to say is, here I am. Levinas echoes the biblical image. When God gives the command, all that you do is to reply, here I am. That's a biblical expression. Here I am, Lord. Behold your servant, Lord. Whatever you may say. And that is what is responsibility. Responsibility for the other is your ability to respond to the demands or the command that is posed to you by the other, by the face of the other, the face that speaks to you. You can be a subject only because if you let yourself be subjected to the other. You need to let the other take you into hostage. You are willing to let go. Now this is in spiritual terms, we say you surrender yourself. Of course we say surrender yourself to God. But also we also say when we see God in other human persons, you surrender yourself to the human persons in whom you see God. Now this is what Mother Teresa would say. I am always a servant of the others. Now it is something similar to that. This is very powerfully biblical. The poor, the orphan and the widow. This is the totally other. The other who are deprived of their rights, their dignity, and they challenge us. And then this is how we discover our subjectivity. My subjectivity is discovered only when I respond to the other and let the other take me as a hostage to subjugate me. I let myself to be subjected by the other with the response, here I am. And Levinas therefore places responsibility over freedom. Now this is how he reverses Sartre. For Sartre, my responsibility follows my freedom. I am free, therefore I am responsible. For Levinas, I am first responsible. It is in my responsibility for the other I discover my freedom. What makes me free is precisely my responsibility for the other, not other way. So he reverses Sartrean understanding of freedom and responsibility. Levinas' ethical thinking is profoundly challenging. It is not surprising because he speaks as a victim of the Holocaust. Of course, he survived the Holocaust, but he lost his family members in the Holocaust, many of them. And therefore, he could understand it is this non-consideration for the other that has led to this unethical persecution and the murder. If only we were to listen to the demands of the vulnerable, the poor, the typical biblical image of the orphan, the widow and the stranger, and then let ourselves be subjected to the demands of the other. That is what enables us to be ethical. Thank you for paying attention. You may have some questions to ask me, so I shall now briefly take some of the questions that you have. Levinas' philosophy, you should understand, is a philosophy of the limit. Perhaps it is not very easy to live, but it keeps constantly ringing into our ears, into our minds, reminding us of the fact that I am responsible for the other. And I can truly find my freedom only in my responsibility for the other. Thank you very much.